So thank you for joining us for the sermon from Elk Grove Presbyterian Church in Elk Grove, California, wherever you may be. Here we are on this first Sunday of August, which means that 2022 tends to be moving along, doesn't it? With a lot of unknowns about what awaits us through the rest of this summer and through the fall. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of things we need to be apprehensive about. But we know that whatever comes our way, we know that God will be with us. That's the hope that we have. Today's lectionary gospel reading is from the 12th chapter of Luke, verses 32 through 40. But I'm going to continue reading the verses that follow that up through verse 48, and a little bit later I'll tell you why I want to read those additional verses. And now there's a special thing that I need you to do. You have an assignment for this as I read these verses. I want you to listen for a theme or a thread that weaves throughout these different readings here. Is there kind of a unifying idea that ties these verses together? Understand your assignment, class? Okay. So listen now for the Word of God, starting at verse 32. Any questions about that assignment? Okay. Just jump right in. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be. Be dressed ready for service and keep your lamps burning, like men waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. I tell you the truth, he will dress himself to serve, will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the second or third watch of the night. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Peter asked him, this is the additional part, Peter asked him, Lord, are you telling this parable to us, referring to the 12, or to everyone? The Lord answered, who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? It will be good for that servant when the master finds him doing so when he returns. I tell you the truth, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose the servant says to himself, my master is taking a long time in coming. And he then begins to beat the men servants and women servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk. The master of that servant will come on the day when he does not expect him, and an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. That servant who knows his master's will and does not get ready, or does not do what the master wants him, will be beaten with many blows. But the one who does not know and does things deserving punishment will be beaten with few blows. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. From the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. Wanting to explore what it may mean to become a follower of Jesus Christ, or wanting to become more faithful disciples of the Christ to whom we may have already committed ourselves long ago and perhaps followed for many, many years, I trust that's why people gather in churches around the world. That's why we gather here this morning, to be with this particular family of believers here at Elk Grove Presbyterian Church for us. And I trust that wherever people are seeking a Christian fellowship that can support and encourage them in their faith journey, or people are by themselves or with a small group of friends who are considering basic questions about what it means to be truly human. Whoever we are, wherever we are, as we know, there's a basic text that can reveal to us a holy God. How a holy God was at work long centuries ago, was uniquely at work in that carpenter from Nazareth, is currently at work in the world, and wants to be at work in our own life, each one of us today. That text, of course, is the Bible, right? The writings from Judaism that we Christians call the Old Testament, the writings from the church that we Christians call the New Testament. And as it has been said, how we approach those scriptures, what we're looking to find, can determine what we do find there, right? Whether those scriptures will help us to become more open to wonder and amazement in the holy other that we call God, and more open to other people, or if we use those scriptures to reinforce negativity and cynicism about life generally, and to scoff at the very idea of God, and to justify prejudice and hatred towards other people. And we know that the Bible has been used for that, right? And while I absolutely believe that the Bible as a whole is about a loving and gracious God, we've mentioned that over and over again, I also know that the Bible as a whole is quite a mixed bag of what I have been calling snippets or incidents, okay? Some seeming to point in the direction of light and hope and love. Some seeming to point in the direction of darkness and confusion, right? And I find that also to be the case throughout Luke's gospel and in what we just read. I want to mention that what we read had been preceded by last week's reading about that bigger barn building plan of the rich fool, right? Then Jesus had said to his disciples not to worry about your life, what to eat or what to wear. He said, consider the ravens, and aren't you more important than the birds? Or consider the lilies of the field, and aren't you more important than flowers? God knows what you need, Jesus said. And then these reassuring words, seek God's kingdom, and all these things will be added to you as well. Then there are different pieces in today's reading, starting with, do not be afraid, little flock. You've been given the kingdom by God. Look to treasure in heaven, for where your heart is, where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be also. But be watchful, like slaves waiting for the return of their master. A master who will then serve them. Reversal. And Jesus issued a warning about a thief who will come in the night, and the Son of Man will come at a time you do not expect him. Better be ready. Better be ready. I found all of that a little bit hard to follow. Did you? Good news, bad news. Don't worry, but better be on your guard. Peter must have been a bit befuddled, I think, so he asked, Lord, are you saying that to us 12 or to everyone? And that seems like a pretty fair question, I would say. To which Jesus then talks about a wise and unwise manager, and slaves who knew what their master wanted, and slaves who didn't know what their master wanted, and how they will be punished differently for their failings. Finally, words about much being demanded of those who have been given or entrusted with much. A whole series of those. Finishing that, I suspect Peter, having asked that question, then thought, well, thank you very much for clarifying that. I think you'd agree it's a mixed bag of images we get there. And that's why I wanted to add those extra verses to get that whole sense. More of the ideas, so many ideas that don't seem to fit together, right? Which is the meaning of the word disparate. I had to look that up, by the way. It means that things or ideas that are at odds with one another. Kind of think of it of a round peg trying to fit into or a square peg in a round hole. They don't work together. And I gotta say that thinking about what to do with these disparate readings, I began to feel rather desperate. How am I going to make sense of a passage that goes in so many different directions? And why did Luke throw all those different pieces together? I mean, at the very beginning of Luke's book, as you recall, he made it clear that he had carefully studied all that had gone on and was writing an orderly account so that his audience could be certain of the truth of what they had heard. Well, what he may have thought was orderly in his mind, I find really disparate, all over the place. Which led me to think maybe disparate is not such a bad description of life itself, right? Going in so many different directions. Think about all the different things that you experience in a day, and a week, and a month, all those different pieces that happen. Like when I woke up on Friday morning, I was thankful that my back wasn't as stiff as sometimes it is. It felt okay that morning. I was lying there in bed for a few minutes, and I heard a dove cooing somewhere outside. You know that wonderful cooing sound? Just delightful. And then the sound of a garbage truck, thank you very much. About the first 10 minutes of the 7 o'clock TV news, that's always a wonderful experience. I saw that the wind was going to make my little bike ride a little bit more challenging that morning. Got a text from Marcus about him going home, but Virginia staying in the hospital for more tests and trying to bring down her pain. Later, as I was driving, there was a young man sitting at a street corner where I was stopped. He got a hood on, he had a sign that said, "Just asking for a blessing." Well, it was easy to give him a blessing, and I was thankful that I was also able to hand him a little care package, which had been put together last Sunday afternoon at the installation of the new pastor at Parkview Presbyterian Church. Contained some water and some goodies and some personal hygienes, and so it was nice to be able to give that to him. Well, on and on and on during the day, one thing after another, after another, after another. How do they fit together? And throughout thinking, I gotta make sense of the scriptures for Sunday morning. And now I wonder whether you found any theme that ran through all those different scriptures, any unifying idea. If you did, you're a better man than I. Now. But then a thought came to me. Maybe making sense of Sunday's text is realizing that it doesn't make sense. That there is no way of putting all those pieces together. There is no unifying theme as such in those scriptures. Just like there's no neat way to tie together all the different things in each one of us lives each day and throughout our life. And maybe Luke knew that perfectly well. He knew that so much that Jesus was trying to do by his teaching and preaching and healing and accepting had not made a whole lot of sense to Peter and the other 11 disciples, or to that special close group of, who knows, a couple of hundred maybe, or to that wider circle of people that followed him. Certainly didn't make any sense to the religious leaders or the Roman rulers. They just knew they had to get rid of him, right? And it didn't make sense for him to die on the cross. What about that mystery of his resurrection? I mean, try to make sense of that. And Luke knew that the early church has struggled with all of that for the previous 30 or 40 years before he had begun writing his book. And the church has certainly struggled to make sense of that for the last 2,000 years. Sometimes beautifully reflecting God's love, sometimes not at all, right? And sometimes it may not make much sense to us. Like, how is it possible that the bread and the juice that we will share in a few minutes can speak to us in the most profound way possible of being loved by a love above all other loves, a love that can free us to love others? Our minds may not be able to make sense of that, yet our hearts sense the truth of that, doesn't it? And maybe that's what Luke believed would ultimately happen. That even with all the disparate stuff in his book that he wrote, and in the whole Bible itself, and even in the disparate things in our own lives, maybe he believed that we too could come to know that the only real theme that ties all those things together is that they're held in the loving hands of a gracious God. The writer of the book of Hebrews summarizes it pretty well. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Luke recounted Peter asking that question, Lord, are you telling that to us or to everyone? Maybe if we were able to ask Luke that same question about his book, he might answer, of course. And he might ask us, for whom are these words not written? My hope in writing this book was that whoever might read these words, whenever and wherever they might read them, my hope is that they will find God speaking to them. And I think God does. About life and hope, about love. May we be willing to hear and respond.